I was asked to say a little bit of word why we need to talk about a global deal for people, or a global Green Deal, or people's demands, because obviously the Green Deal frame works very much in the global north, and it has particular roots, of course, because of the US. But it's growing, right? I mean, it's growing. You've seen it now in the United States with both Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, but many of the Democrats talking about a Green Deal. Obviously, in the elections now, we've got climate moving up the agenda, and people in the Labour Party talking about a Green Deal. Similarly, in Spain, there's talk of a Green Deal as the Spanish elections are taking place. Interestingly, the European Commission has tried to adopt the word Green Deal and is talking about its policies as being a European Green Deal. But it's very much dominating and it's growing in the global north. But I wanted to talk about why we needed a much deeper and broader just or a justice transition. So let me see if this works. Oh, don't think it has. Oh, because I'm not connected. I would ask you to go and have a look at this. You can just, Ed Hawkins does it. It's just the temperature spiral. Probably most people have seen this. And the point I wanted to show about this spiral was, about how fast temperatures have risen. But at what point they suddenly explode in terms of how fast we see this increase. And it mirrors the very moment, and when you can say governments knew about climate crisis, NGOs knew about the climate crisis, companies knew about the climate crisis, and it raises a really profound issue, because for a long time people, particularly in the mainstream, had seen climate change as being something basically a technical issue, right? It was a technical issue. We simply needed to reduce carbon from A to B. If we were acted rationally, we had some advocacy to our governments, produce the right reports, governments would act rationally, and hey, voila, we'd be where we needed to be. And that was, fundamentally a mistake for many, many reasons. One of those, actually, they don't understand power, and they don't understand what change looks like, right? Because when you're trying to transform not just fossil fuels, but actually fundamentally a much bigger issue about our economy, because fossil fuels wasn't something that our economy is there and then fossil fuels was built around it. Our modern economy is built around fossil fuels. It's been the other way around. And so why you have this lack of action? And of course, you probably know about the Paris Agreement in 2015. It was very much welcomed, and there was lots of hoopla around it. Governments all said, yeah, we're there, we've done it, etc. But what's, of course, most really important to recognise is that the pledges that are in the Paris Agreement will lead us to at least 3.5 degrees warming, and anything up to 7 degrees warming. And nothing at the moment, since Paris, has led to any dip in that temperature sort of trajectory that we're in. You don't need to be a rocket scientist or a climate scientist anymore to know about what that impact of climate change is there. And it's happening right in front of our eyes, right? We've seen the Amazon burning, Arctic ice melting, even the Arctic has been burning. We've seen coral reef bleaching, killer floods, droughts everywhere in the world, basically supercharged hurricanes and cyclones. In Pakistan, where I'm originally from, we've had a heat wave of 53.5 degrees centigrade. 53.5 degrees centigrade is just under what Death Valley is. And there's a reason why it's called Death Valley. It's because it's literally the upper end of what a human being can tolerate. In Pakistan, we have 4 out of 10 people face multiple dimensional poverty, where one pushes people who are barely surviving into not surviving at all. So when people are hitting 53.5 degrees centigrade heat wave, they haven't got the choice like we had in Europe over the summer. Of let's go into an office with air conditioning, let's go down to the swimming pools, let's take the day off, let's sit in the park. This is what we're talking about, people who have to be out in the open working. When we've had those heat waves now, coming regularly every couple of years. The last time it came, the government literally built mass graves. We had 1,200 people die in one city alone. In India this summer, 5th biggest city, Chennai, ran out of water. And it's now predicted by 2030, 40% of India's population of 1.3 billion people will be without access to fresh water. This is the scale of what's happening. We have 1 million people on the brink of starvation in Mozambique. And you probably remember the 2 cyclones that hit Mozambique earlier this year. That 1 million people are on the brink, not because of that cyclone itself, it's because the state now is unable to feed its own people. Why? Because, of course, decades of our structural adjustment programs, the power of our corporations has meant that we've gutted Mozambique as an economy and a society. In fact, 40% of Mozambique's income that comes in, it goes back out in paying in terms of debt to the banks. And when that cyclone happened, do you know what had to happen? Mozambique, the government had to come to the City of London and ask for more debt-creating loans. And that's what happened, and that's how it is now trying to feed its own people. We've seen, of course, in the Caribbean islands, from Dominica to Bahamas to Puerto Rico, absolute lying ruins. And we know the reality of what we're seeing with indigenous communities under threat all across Latin America. Now, sometimes when we talk about climate change, we say 1 degree and 1.5 degree. Obviously, it doesn't sound very much, especially when most of us, like, when we look out there and say, God, I wish it was like, 25, 26. That's a huge amount. Well, the 0.5 degree, of course, there's two things to always bear in mind. When we talk about 1 or 1.5 degree, we talk about that's an average. The reality is, particularly in the tropics and on the equator, we're talking sometimes up to 4 to 5 times that heat. So when we talk about 1 or 1.5, sometimes we're talking up about between 6 to 7 to 8 degrees in the global south. So you see what the difference between just simply that 1 and 1.5 degree has been. In terms of 2.5 times more people will be affected by extreme heat. We'll see the collapse in terms of food production. We'll see sea level rises. We'll see what was happening in terms of the Arctic Ocean from being 1 in 100 years to happening once every 10 years. We see literally the end of the coral reefs. And if we remember that 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people rely on fish for protein, then that has severe impact, reality of what that will mean for more and more people in terms of the global south. Now, one thing that people don't talk about also, I mean, in climate terms, for a long time, the climate negotiations were always concerned about this key thing, mitigation. How do we cut our emissions? And then slowly, as it became apparent that countries weren't cutting their emissions, or rich countries weren't cutting their emissions, the second thing came up, the second pillar, which was adaptation. Can we adapt to this increase in temperature? What would that mean? And for, of course, more and more people in the global south, the key struggle was adaptation. Now, the reality is, just at 1 degree warming, we're already starting talking about what are the loss and damages. Which is, what is it that no matter what we do now, we're already going to lose? And those are everything from, of course, physical assets. So we see when Dominica and Puerto Rico and the Bahamas was hit, we're not just talking about devastation in terms of about people, we're talking about literally every piece of infrastructure gone. Now, when sea level goes up and we start to lose islands and we start to lose coastal areas, we see these two extreme events happening. Slow onset events, which are basically very, very slow, but they are just happening. And then, of course, the extreme events that we see, which are the extreme weather ones. I want to say that just because, again, a lot of times in climate discussions or in the just transition, we don't talk about this third pillar. Now, just at what you all probably know, the IPCC report, the famous report that came out in 2018, it sent shockwaves, particularly in the global north, right? I mean, you could say it kick-started Extinction Rebellion, it kick-started Fridays for the Future, the youth climate strike, it certainly inspired and it elevated what Greta was doing in Sweden. It sent shockwaves because the IPCC report, if you haven't read it, you should read the summary report, it's really important, but also recognise that the IPCC report is negotiated word for word by governments. So that's the lowest common denominator of what's acceptable and what is being approved. Actually, most climate scientists are now saying what's written in the IPCC report is probably a huge underestimation. Most climate scientists are saying actually the warming is happening up to 3 times faster than the models are saying in the IPCC report. But we see it, just of that 1.5 degree warming, we're told now that that's the tipping point, right? And if you breach this guardrail, it's crucial and will have huge impacts all around the world. And as the chair of the IPCC has said, this is the largest clarion call bell from the science community, and I hope it mobilises people and dents the mood of complacency. And if you look at that report really goes into great detail. It sets out what will happen in terms of increased risk of droughts and floods, the eradication of coral reefs, water and food scarcity, the economic impacts that will happen on health, of increasing conflict, because of course we talk about climate change Now, one of the great injustices about climate change, as we all know, is the people who are the least responsible are the ones most impacted, and the ones who are the most responsible are the least impacted. But climate change is not just an injustice in itself. It fuels every other existing inequality and injustice in the world. Now, for a long time, people have talked about conflict and said, oh, okay, that's not, conflict, it's really, there's many, many different reasons for conflict, and of course there are. But it's now true also that climate change has a profound impact on that. And you can talk about, for example, Syria, right? Now, there are many, many reasons why there was a conflict in Syria, but there's no doubt about it that the fact that Syria had one of its longest, most profound droughts, which led to 1 million people from rural areas moving to urban areas, which led to a collapse in agriculture, which led to something like 90% of all livestock dying, exasperated existing tensions and fueled what was already, of course, a dictatorship, but already fueled that. It's the conflict in Darfur that we were often told, these are ethnic conflicts. We now understand far better that these were conflicts now about water scarcity, as people lose land, as people move and come into conflict with other, and there are wars and there are conflicts about natural resources. The Arab Spring, now, of course, the Arab Spring was a huge explosion about democracy, but it's also true that it came about because there'd been a collapse in the harvest for 3 years running, that food prices had tripled, that people were barely surviving, basically got pushed into not surviving, and then came out on the streets. Basically, climate change fuels every other existing inequality. Now, this is a very, very conservative reading, and this is about just the scale of displacements that we're seeing. Because one of the other stories about, of course, displacement, we're told now, that about migration is a huge issue, of course, and the far right fuel that. This is on the left-hand side is just the displacement that is calculated from conflict, right, from violence, from armed conflict, and the one on the right-hand side, the blue, is now the new displacement that's happening because of either extreme weather events that are happening or because of people losing their homes. You actually start to see that more and more people are now losing their homes and being displaced from environmental reasons as much as reasons in terms of conflict. And that's important because, of course, you all know that the only people who've got legal protection under international law are the people who are on the left-hand side under the Refugee Convention. Everybody on the right-hand side is largely left unprotected, and the majority of people actually on the right, and the majority of people never get calculated because they're, of course, internally displaced within poorer countries. Right, up to about 85% of all people who are being forced from their homes are displaced internally and never cross a transnational border, or if they do, they cross one to another poor country. And if you start to look at where all of those, both the conflict and the climate displacement, you'll start to see there is a huge belt, right? I mean, that's where the worst impacts of climate change and warming are already occurring. Climate change has never been an environmental issue. I spent 10 years at the UN climate negotiator working with developing countries and with social movement. And I'll tell you, having sat in 10 years of UN negotiations, the last thing that the UN climate talks are about is about the environment. They're about the political economy. They're about governments protecting their economy. And you could say this is about the global north protecting itself vis-a-vis the demands of the global south. And if you look at the history of climate negotiations from 1992, when the UN Climate Convention is first written and agreed, and it sets into stone some really important principles, such as there's common but differentiated responsibility, i.e. everybody has to act on climate change, but there's a different responsibility for the ones who are the most responsible, the richest countries, and this idea of polluter pays, and that rich countries, not only we're going to cut their own emissions, but we're going to provide finance and support and technology to poorer countries who are dealing with also eradicating poverty. Really fundamental and important principles that were written into the climate negotiation, and that for the last 30 to 40 years since then, so 40 isn't bloody hell, 30 years, some rich countries have been trying to escape out of that. They escape out of their obligations. And often when people say, why haven't the climate negotiations ever solved this problem? Well, because actually the climate negotiations are pretty much a microcosm of a much bigger fight that's going on globally between those that with power and those that haven't. Now, we're in this decade zero. Now, I want to put this up because often we're told, you know, we've got to aim for 2050. Now, in the IPCC does call for decarbonisation by 2050. But it also says to do that, rich countries have to cut by zero, close to by 2030, to allow poorer countries a bit more time to be able to decarbonise their economy. Now, the IPCC estimates there's about 360 gigatons left of carbon pollution if you want to stop a breach of the 1.5 degree. You know that works out at about 8.5 years. That's about how much it works out at. And that is a 50-50 chance of not breaching 1.5 degrees. Now, none of us would get on a bus, taxi or anything if there was a 50-50 chance of that crashing. But that's exactly the logic of which we are expected and we're told is acceptable for policymakers. Now, so if you were in from the global south, you'd be saying, hold on a minute, we've got 5 years left before we breach this critical guardrail which we're going to impact. But of course, in rich countries, people talk about 2050, and the UK Climate Change Committee, which set the government target of 2050, if you look at what the UK Climate Change Committee said, it said, you know, there's a big issue about equity, i.e. those that have done more and consume more of their carbon. It's so important, but we're not going to consider it. Oh yeah, there is an issue about the fact that negative emissions technology. Yeah, these are all negative emissions technologies. None of them are proven. None of them can be run to scale at this moment, apart from one, which is bioenergy carbon capture and storage. Now, bioenergy carbon capture and storage would require about 3 times the landmass of India for it to work. And where is that land? Where? Have we got 3 times India sitting somewhere? Because at the same time we're told we must reforest and afforest all of the dwindling land that is available. So of course the reality is at the moment for many people in the global north and for many policymakers, they've got their fingers crossed and hopes for some miracle answer. Now, you know why that is? Because the UK Climate Change Committee said its first most important priority was what would cause the least disruption to the British economy? And how do we only spend up to 2% of our GDP? And if we did that, then we're at 2050. And it reminded me a lot of when I first joined the climate movement. Because for a long time, of course, like many people, I thought, climate, that's not really for me. You know, it's a bunch of white liberals. I'm there on racial justice, economic justice, front line, big struggles. And then I realised, when working with our movements, that climate change was the place where every single fight was retaking place. And that if we want to stand with the poorest and with our movements in the global south, then we had to stand on climate change. Now, for a long time, I very much was a very critical voice in the environment movement, thinking the reason why we are where we are is because the climate movement made every mistake possible. I mean, it chose as an image a white polar bear and a white iceberg for the most profound political issue of our time, something that would have absolutely no resonance with the majority of people and would see something as being alien. And then it talked about it in parts per million or in technical issues, not in any way that would engage people or build people's political agency. But I used to be told, you know, we're all, I said, well, I was told 2 things. I said, you're just too radical. You've got to learn to work within the system. And I would always say, well, that's really easy if you're not dying from that system. Then you can say to people, work within the system. If you're dying from the system, then that system's not necessarily working for you. And the other thing I used to be told is, we're all on the proverbial Titanic. You've probably heard this, right? We're all on the Titanic, sailing along. We're going to hit the proverbial iceberg. Oops, we've hit it. You know, it's all hands on deck. And I would say, well, actually, that's not quite true, is it? Because on the deck of the Titanic are still the citizens of the global north. They're still sipping cocktails, listening to the orchestra, thinking there's going to be some miraculous technological answer that's going to rescue them. And in the hull of the Titanic is where the poorest of the poor are. It's where the global south is. And they're already drowning. And when they try and get out of that hold, they find that they're locked in. I said that's the better analogy of where we are in this world. And I say that because there's a politics of sacrifice in the global south, right? Now, there are some people who say, our answer to the climate crisis is simply one about pausing the world where it is, and then trying to just, in a straight line, end as much carbon or reduce as much carbon as we can. But the reality is we're living in a very, very unequal world, right? We have about 2 billion people without proper access to water. We have 2 billion people who go hungry each and every day, right? Yet we produce food, 3 times the amount of food that could feed the world, right? 80% of all of the poorest people in the world rely on, guess how much land for their food? 25%. The rest of the land is used for commodities to export to the global north. We can feed the world 3 times over, right? We have about 2 billion people in the informal economy at the moment with absolutely no rights at all. And those workers who are in the formal economy, they're the ones at the most at risk of automation. It's now estimated that something like between 40 to 60% of all workers who are in the formal economy in the global south are the ones who are going to be most affected by automation. We have about 3.3 billion people who don't have any access to electricity or clean cooking, right? And if we think about what the impact on people's health is of having to rely on biomass for cooking, and we have about 3.5 billion people at this moment who live on less than $5 a day, denied the very basics of a dignified life. And I think for us, we must always remember our starting point is an unequal world. And that's not our answer. Our answer can't be based on simply protecting the unequal world to protect citizens in the global north. And this other carbon brief one, I wanted to, again, I think everybody should have that graph over there, because it tells you what the carbon budget for what we've got. This was done about 2 years ago. 66% for 6 years left of 1.5. If you have a 2/3 chance of keeping below 1.5. But if you're fine and you say, well, I'm happy with sacrificing quite a few more people to extreme weather, to impacts on food, maybe I'll go for just a third of chance of keeping below 1.5. Then you've got 17 years. If you don't care at all and you want to breach into 2 degrees, knowing what the impacts are going to be, then you've got 20 years, or you've got 28 years. And when you think about people who talk about net zero by 2050, what they're basically saying is 50% are keeping below 2 degrees. That's what targets by the 2050 will do. Now, which has absolutely no sense to what we've been told in terms of the climate science. The other graph, you should probably all seen this one on the left-hand side, right? The famous champagne glass, right? Famous champagne glass. Richest 10% of the world, responsible for nearly half of all global emissions. The poorest 50% of the world, altogether responsible for only 10% of emissions. Now, this was a famous graph. It came out, Oxfam did this study on it. It was brilliant about where CO2 emissions. But for us, you've always got to tie this with this other champagne glass, which talks about income in the world, right? Because you see this incredible thing. The same 50% of the 10% of the world's population, there at the top, receive about 52% of all global wealth. And the poorest 10% only receive 8% of global wealth. It's estimated now that if you're in the poorest 50% of the world, your income is going up about 2 cents a year. It'll take you about 200 years to meet the lowest poverty level. To lead a dignified life, we'd be here till about 500 years, right? Whilst the people at the top, the richest people at the top, become richer and richer. The top 1% is taking about 16 trillion at the moment. You might have heard about you probably saw that thing about Bezos and Amazon. And I think it's just an incredible thing, right? If from the moment, there's two analogies, because we're in Belfast and I know religion plays a big part here, let's use the Jesus one. If one of us was alive when Jesus was alive, and then somebody decided to give us $1,000 each and every day from then to now, we'd not be a billionaire. Bezos earns that in 4 days. That's the extreme inequalities we're starting to see. It's just incredible, right? You can be alive every single day, be given $1,000 for the last 2,000 years, and you still wouldn't be a billionaire. And yet, the extreme wealth and the elites, the top 1%, are amassing so much income. I see all of that as our grounding, right? That was my background to what I want to actually talk about. Now, John told me that there's a mural of Frederick Douglass up on the Falls Road, so you probably know, do you know Frederick Douglass? Do you know who Frederick? Yeah. So, you know, he was a very, very famous African-American. He's considered one of the greatest orators of his time. In fact, some people say he was one of the greatest orators. And he said two things which I think really important and we're often missing in climate discussions. First, power concedes nothing without demand. It never did and it never will, right? So when we're talking about tackling the climate crisis, we have to recognize the powerful vested interests ahead of us. And they are never going to consider giving up that power if we simply call for action on climate change. It requires us transformational demands. And it requires us to also understand a theory of change, that without struggle, there is no progress, right? And this is not a point where those with the power, those that are profiting, are simply going to turn around and say, okay, yeah, you're right. In fact, what they talk about, as Bezos talks about, is how can we escape this doomed planet and go off into space and mine the asteroids there instead. Now, so when we, as progressive people, right, as people in the labour movement, as activists, think about this just transition, I think our starting point has got to be, so who's this just transition for? Right? Who for? Because there's one way of thinking about just transition, which is increasingly what's happening in the global north, where you think about just transition as being, well, we have to shut down or bring down particular sectors of our economy. So a just transition is simply about those workers making sure they've got some pension, that if we have to, scale down our operations, that those workers aren't thrown onto the scrap heap. Absolutely, really, really important. As somebody whose first industrial struggle was the miners' strike, absolutely key, because we've seen what the devastation it does to working class communities. But is that all that just transition is? And whose reality are we going to root that just transition in? Because there's a different reality in the global north to one that's in the global south, in terms of what are we trying to transition to and from? And how is that transition going to be financed? Now, there's a lot of conversations, as I said, in the global north about we're going to have this just transition, we're going to redistribute a bit of wealth and income, we're going to tackle a decade of austerity and inequality. But is that going to be on the same basis of the same exploitation of natural resources of the global south? Since 1980, something like 16 trillion has flowed from the global south to the global north in capital profit from the exploitation of natural resources. Something like 13 trillion has gone in illicit tax flows to tax havens, right? Something like 4.3 trillion from the global south has gone to the global north in debt repayments. And it's not just about them, right? This resource extraction, is this just a transition going to be built on more resource extraction? Because often we're told, well, all it will be, we'll just green our economy, right? We'll switch from fossil fuels to renewables. Forget what that will mean in terms of resources and new material extraction that will be needed. About 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now, we were at BHP Billiton, which is a big mining giant, their AGM. We had communities from Chile, Colombia and Brazil with us. And we went there and the Chilean community spoke about this new copper mine that BHP Billiton is opening in Chile. It's 40,000 tons of copper each and every year. It's in an area which is a very fragile ecosystem, right under where the glaciers are, affect water for millions of people, affect air quality for millions and millions of people. Huge opposition to it. And BHP Billiton, the chair of the BHP Billiton said, we need it for the new green transition. He actually used the word, the Green New Deal. We're a part of the Green New Deal, he said. So another question about, I think for us, is who are we taking power from, right? Because I think that's really, really important in our conversation, and who are we building power with. And I say those because, there's a climate story of the UK, and I want to give you my climate story of the UK, right? We're the 5th richest economy in the world. There's a reason why we're the 5th richest economy in the world. And No offence, but it's not because there was some peculiarly, thing about the British people that they were superiorly genius in any way. No, it's because we were, a very brutal and efficient exploiter of resources and people, right? Just from slavery, when British traders enslaved 1.5 million people of African descent, they earned close to $8 billion. The slave merchants were the richest people in Britain. They invested in everything from our schools, from the universities, to the roads, to the canals, to the infrastructure. They financed the Industrial Revolution. They're the people who gave the money to James Watt for invention. They financed the banks. The Barclays Bank was created from slave money. And it's estimated in the 1770s, £4 million was being invested in the British economy each and every year. 3.8 million of it, it's estimated, came from slave profits. So you could say, slavery, the profits of slavery are in every brick and mortar in the UK. It's how the UK was able to finance its the industrialisation. And it wasn't just about past, right? It wasn't just about slavery. When the British came to India, India's share of the global GDP was about 24.4%. When Britain left, it was 4%. In that time, it's estimated that Britain took out of India alone, forget what they took out of Africa or the Caribbean or anywhere else, $45 trillion. 45, that's 16 times the UK's GDP. It's said that Britain never spent a single penny of its own income on any of its wars or expansion. It used the money from the colonial exploitation. And what was all of this exploitation always about? It was always about control of natural resources. Right? So how Britain became the 5th richest economy. And it's not just, of course, about those periods then. It's about now. We've got a report of new colonialism in Africa, which estimates that there are British companies own £1 trillion worth of shares of minerals and extractors of the continent of Africa. That's more than the whole of the GDP of every single sub-Saharan African country put together. We control that. British companies control that. The City of London is about 22% of UK's GDP. A third of all the shares on the FTSE 100 are from the extractive industry. You could say literally that the British economy continues to be powered by extractivism in one way or another. People often say of Britain, well, we're a tiny country, we haven't got that much, we're not responsible for that much. Actually, if you look at historical responsibility, we're the 5th biggest historical responsible, biggest polluter in the world, right? Historically, if you take us in our total, and our fair share, guess what our fair share would be? If we did actually what our fair share of emission reductions would be, we'd be about minus 208% by 2030. That's actually our fair share. Everything that we're not doing is just simply consuming more of the carbon budget. Often now people talk about a Green Deal, and they talk about a Green Deal and say, well, okay, we've got to tackle the climate crisis, we're going to try and end austerity, and we're going to try and green the economy. And it's really interesting because we face this moment of a fight around the global commons, and the left's best answer is within the nation state. It's to say, well, we'll green our economy, right? We'll green our nation state economy. We'll invest public investment, absolutely. We'll redirect lots of public investment and we'll build our infrastructure. We'll green things, all absolutely really important things. We'll retrofit our homes, we'll invest in new transport, and we'll have these whole new jobs and we'll guarantee everybody a living wage. Oh, and by the way, let's not really think about that issue about migration over there, because the answer to that traditionally will still be militarised borders. That's not my answer. It's one part of the answer, but it's not my answer, and I don't think it should be the Labour movement's answer. I think we have a moment where we have to start talking about how do we build our collective power? How do we build a movement of movements? And we all know this, right? To build a movement of movements, you have to have a vision. Your vision can't be, oh, well, it's just the climate crisis and it's polar bears. It's got to be a vision that people can see that we believe in, right? You've got to be able to describe the world that we want, because that's the only way that people will believe you and believe us, that that's what we're fighting for. And we all know that you can have resist, Resist is easy. You can say no to stuff. But if you want profound change comes when people believe in a vision for something. It's the story of social history and of social development over the last, well, from time immemorial. You've got to have a story. We've got to have a story. And what's our story? Well, the story for a long time was climate change, as I said, was polar bears and innocent and passive victims. And now it's, well, we've got to do this because the crisis is for our children or our children's children. But what about the people who are already dying? Right? We've got to have a much more important story. And I'm often told, well, you know, that story, it's just really difficult, right? You've got to connect people to where they are, and that's why we tell the story that we tell the story. And frankly, I don't believe it. Because I think there's a much more powerful story, right, that often is forgotten, that the left and progressive people forget. When Britain, when the Civil War was taking place in the United States, and of course the North was blockading the South, cotton was very difficult to come to Lancashire and Yorkshire, and the merchants in Liverpool, you know what they did? They built warships for the Confederates to keep the slavery going because they were profiting so much. And but there was what was called the cotton famine, right? No cotton was coming from the slave plantations, and people were walking in Lancashire, and they say that if mill factories had gone silent, you know, and people were destitute, and people were hungry. And then in Rochdale, there's an incredible story of cotton came through from slave trade, and the people in Rochdale refused to handle the cotton from slavery, even though they were destitute. They said, our struggle is part of a much bigger struggle, a much bigger story of humanity. And I look at that, and I remember, you know, I showed you Frederick Douglass, you know, and obviously a lot of time we're told William Wilberforce, right, ended slavery. Well, Frederick Douglass toured Britain, as did many, many people, you know, freed slaves, talking to working class communities up and down this country. In East London, where I live, where Sugar Tate and Lyle factory is, you know, people boycotted Tate and Lyle. Working class people boycotted Tate and Lyle because they heard the story of what was taking place in terms of the slave trade. It said that if slaves who jumped ship, if they got to East London, they would be safe because the police were more scared, slave catchers were more scared of going into those working class communities, right? Because people understood they had a base level of solidarity. And I think that's really important for us, right? I mentioned the miners' strike. In British trade union history, right, there's it's not always been very progressive, right? If you think about the 1960s and 70s, British trade unionists were marching with Enoch Powell, right, calling for black people to be repatriated. And in 1976, maybe was a strike, so the Grunwick strike. It was Asian women striking at a photo processing plant in North London about the right to join a union. And these were Asian women, so all the stereotype of Asian women, and they went out and strike. And as that strike built, and they're from their community, they built links, such links that 10,000 miners from Yorkshire came down to support the Grunwick strikers. Because they said, actually, this isn't about black workers lowering our salary, our wages. Actually, this is about all of us workers, that if we win the right to join the union, we're all strengthened. And they understood what that solidarity was. And I say that because during the miners' strike in 1984, the mosques and the temples and the gurdwaras in Britain, a lot of them opened their doors to the miners, started feeding the miners. Because they said, we remember in 1976 when you came with the Grunwick strikers. And that, for me, is really powerful stories. We have to tell ourselves those stories again. And you know, I mean, the Dunnis workers in Dublin, right? 21-year-old refusing to handle South African products, being disciplined and suspended, and still standing, even without the support of the trade union movement, even without the support of many, many progressive people, stood resolute. So much so that, of course, you know, when South Africa was free, who were guests of honours, because people understood what that solidarity. We have to start telling our stories, a story of solidarity, a story that goes beyond our borders. And we've got to have demands, really popular demands, not artificial, not technical demands, but popular demands that connect with people. And we've got to have behind those popular demands, of course, policy demands. Now, this is my story of what we need, right? This is my story that fundamentally the only way we're going to tackle the climate crisis is if we start to talk about this is a fight for the commons. Because it is a fight for the commons. There is no way, there is absolutely no way we can turn our fossil fuel energy system into a renewable energy system. There's no way. Even in all the scenarios, at the moment, it's estimated that energy demand will go up by 60%. We need to decrease it by 40%. So the only way we can do that is if we start talking about what is the energy for? What's productive energy? What's useful energy? Who has access to energy? Now, of course, many people in progressive places, like in the trade unions, are saying, well, one of the things we can do is we can talk about control of energy, right? We can talk about democratic control of energy. And absolutely, so we now talk about decentralised energy systems, tenants, workers' organisations, cooperatives, owning energy. But we're still only talking about distribution of energy, right? And we're talking about generation of energy. We actually have to start talking about, what about extraction of energy? How do you control that? You can only control that with environmental limits and do it fairly if you start to see it as a commons. It's the same with water, right? I mean, if we look at what's happened with water, a fundamental right, we see that more and more people will have less and less access to water, and yet water is overwhelmingly now privatised and controlled by private corporations around the world. We have to start thinking about land, food, water as issues of the global commons, because climate change is, of course, an issue of the global commons. We have to start talking about, it's no good just us calling for workers' rights and a living wage here. We have to demand a living wage absolutely everywhere, and it is possible. So when we talk about a trade unionist and the people in the labour movement, we want workers' rights for workers in, let's say, we talk with shop workers. We should be doing it all the way through the supply chain. We need to start building international solidarity, and it's possible for us to demand a living wage for a shop worker working here and a living wage for the Bangladeshi garment worker who's producing the clothes when we're being paid 11 pence an hour, as well as a living wage for the farmer who's producing the cotton. Because these are the corporate supply chains. And at the moment, all we do as a labour movement is we fight individual fights along that supply chain. We don't internationalise our struggle. We have to start to do that. So, because that, even in a climate term, is one of the key determining factors of what happens to you when climate impacts happen. When Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines, right, 2 million people were displaced, 7,000 people were killed. Of those 2 million people displaced, only 2% of them were rehoused in that area. The majority were forced into slums in the big cities. Why? Because in that moment of crisis, income determines, your access to wealth determines and shapes your decisions. If we talk about NHS here, if we talk about the NHS and public services here, we should be talking about a global NHS, a global education system, global rights to housing. And we think that's pie in the sky. Each of those are all possible. Financially are possible. Technically are possible. We've just lost the vision. We've lost our ability to be able to think beyond the parameters of neoliberalism. Whilst those top three, they sound so radical, don't they? I mean, really, they do sound radical, innit? A global living wage, a universal public services. And then you think, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights guaranteed every one of those. 71 years ago it guaranteed that. It said absolutely everybody, irrespective of your race, your ethnicity, your religion, you would have the right to housing and education and health. You have the right to a safe job, and you'd have right to income. What's happened to us in 70 years that we forgot that those should be part and parcel of our demands, that we have to reimagine those demands as part of it. But we can only do that actually if we also start thinking about the architecture of the world, right? The global finance and trade, so it works for us. right? Because as I said, at the moment, that is rigged against the global south. The global south economies have absolutely no opportunity to be able to invest in their public services. Our overseas aid, the ODA that comes out of our taxpayers' money, the majority of it, the primary goal of it, first, is not poverty. The primary goal is written in by the UK government, is it has to benefit British companies. And UK aid is going to finance dirty energy. It's financing privatising of people's education system, of people's health system, so that British companies can go and profit from privatising. That determines people's ability to be able to survive. Our trade rules, we all know our trade rules are fixed, right? Are fixed both in terms of globalisation, but also they're really important. If we want people in the global south to be able to deal with the impacts, we need to lift up intellectual property rights, because trade is very, very little about now between a product from moving from A to B. It's much more about the rules of the system. So trade has to be part and parcel of that. So does migration. People need to be able to have the right to move. But you know what? I was just saying to John, I've just come back from Malaysia, where we've had a gathering of Asian movements from Southeast Asia and South Asia, looking at both migration and loss and damage, people working on the front line. And the number one thing that most communities, and literally everybody said, we don't want to move. We don't want to move. We want to have the right not to move. When you think about the right not to move, you know what that right not to move is? What determines it is whether you have access to public services. So whether you have access to some income. That is the biggest adaptive measures, right? It's not about how resilient. That is what builds the resilience of communities to be able to survive. And of course, we've got to take our foot off the neck of the global south. If every penny that the global south is earning, it comes back to financing the global north, then of course the global south is being sacrificed, even in our new vision. And I say that, and you probably know Audre Lorde, and I love this quote because I think it's really important for us, right? People who are rooted in progressive ideas under the Labour movement, that when we talk about the just transition, we know there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. And I think that's absolutely true. And this is the moment for us to tell a much bigger, more powerful, connected story, so that when we win social license here in the global north, we're also winning it in the global south as well. Yeah, because it is a big challenge to us. Remember what you probably remember when Macron introduced the carbon tax. Do you remember the banner on the first Yellow Vest protest? Right. Do you remember the first Yellow Vest? The first protest of the Yellow Vest said, "The elites worry about the end of the world. Ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month." Mm-hmm. So of course we have to answer that. That's why our demands in the UK have got to be retrofit everybody's homes. You know, the answer is not going to be found in electric batteries. The answer is going to be free public transport, electrified. It's not building 2.5 million new electric cars on the road. We've got to really think much more profound about our economy and about our society. But if we do it, we can have a better, cleaner, healthier society, happier for everybody. But we can also do it for the rest of the world. So rather than we fight here and then have our fight should be connected. And that's our biggest challenge now. And why I say what we need is not just a just transition, but a much deeper, more profound justice transition. Thank you.